Good afternoon. This is my second broadcast. I'm still not totally comfortable doing this because it's very difficult for me to see you, and it's much easier to speak to people you can see. But I'm enjoying it. Installment 2, the first thing I want to do is refer back to the last thing I talked about in installment 1. And the end of that installment, Joel, who is a young man, was in his attic bedroom, and there was a blinding flash of light. And just before he went unconscious, he heard a voice, a man's voice he didn't recognize, call his name, Joel. That was the start of a supernatural event for Joel. The next part of this story is prior to that terrible storm. So we're going back a couple of weeks to set the story. And so I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Also, when I talk about that, I'm going to be talking about teachers a little bit. Now, most of you probably know what a teacher is. You may even have had one. And perchance you had one that you liked, or perchance you had one you weren't quite so certain about. One of the teachers I remember served as a model for this next little bit of story I'm going to read you. When I first met this grumpy old man, I was in grade 9. I was in a school full of a lot of people that came from maybe nicer places than I did. But he did me a big favor. He kept me after school every day for the first month. He kept me and another boy whose name I won't mention. I'm not sure why he kept us, but somehow we always ended up with detentions. Now, I did come from a rough neighborhood, and perhaps I was doing things in class that I didn't realize were improper. But anyway, Mr. Finch, you will visit me the day after school. And he had a list of names, usually 2 or 3, and somehow, as always, Mr. Finch was one of them. And so I'll read you a little bit of what's happening in this classroom because it's important, because eventually it becomes an important part of the story. Here we go. What answer do you have for number 6, Mr. Franklin? That's the hero in the story. He's a young man then. Mr. Graff spoke suddenly, at least it was sudden to me. I stood up and nervously said, "Sir, the answer is 17.2, or decimal 2. I was proud of myself. I'd paid attention. My reward was, Mr. Franklin, this is not a game of horseshoes. 17.2 is not good enough. 17.2 is just a leaner. Mr. Franklin, please sit down." Then with his hand on his chin and surveying the rest of the classroom, he said, "Let me see, who thinks they have the correct answer?" He paused and focused on one of the students. "Mr. J. Jarvis, what answer do you have?" Jay, trying not to be smug, said, "Sir, I believe the correct answer is 17.2 square inches." "Mr. J. Jarvis, you are correct," he announced. Then turning and looking at me, Mr. Graff said, "Mr. Franklin, do you see the error of your ways?" "Yes, sir," I said. My answer was not accurate enough. I omitted the units. "In mathematics, Mr. Franklin, you must be accurate. In this discipline, you have a choice. You could be right or you could be wrong. Things are not gray or off-white. They are either correct or incorrect. Best you remember that." It would be hard to forget. Everyone in this class had heard the theme and slight variations of it on a regular basis. I sat down sweating. It was not that it was hot, but rather I'm not very good at handling public embarrassment yet. That teacher I told you about, that's exactly the kind of thing he would say. Now, the fellow in the story, Joel Franklin, is in, I think, grade 12. I met this great teacher, and he was a great teacher. He later taught at university as an even older man. I won't reveal his name, but most of us, by the time we'd finished at least a year with him, respected what he was trying to tell us. So you can see that there's a mathematical idea involved here somewhere. Otherwise, I wouldn't have taken you to Mr. Graff's class. With 5 minutes to go in the class, Mr. Graff announced, "Please pay careful attention. I have an important assignment for you. It'll be worth 25% of your term mark. Please take your pen and on a piece of paper jot down what is required. If you have a question, then at the end of the day, I will answer them. You are to produce a field report based on an outdoor trigonometry exercise." Now, maybe you don't know what trigonometry is, or maybe you do. But way back when, it was a course that was taught. And of course, it's still very important today, but it's probably part of some other syllabus. You will be using a baseline, and you will be measuring some angles in order to determine the distance to an object, to a faraway object. You're to select a local landmark. The choice is up to you. It'll be a practical opportunity for you to use what you've learned in trigonometry. You may collaborate with a partner. Well, Jay and I exchanged glances, and we became partners. I'm speaking as Joel. So the next problem was find a local landmark that we could use that might produce a good mark. Now, my good friend Jay was a very clever fellow, and he didn't want just a mark. He wanted the best mark he could get. So on our way home, we talked about things. We also met up with our friends. Georgie was my special friend, and Sylvia was his special friend. As we walked home, we talked about potential landmarks. What would they be? What would we use? And we talked about things that were in town. And then we realized, no, everybody will be picking those things. Tallest building, a church tower, the flagpole, and the town square. We can't use those things. Everyone will use those. And then, after a few minutes, Georgie said, "I'm going to visit my cousins in the country. They only live 12 miles out of town, near Goshawk. That's not far from Chaseford, aka Stratford. They live on the south edge of the village. And you know there's a very large bush near there," Jay said. "Some of my relatives up that way own the bushland." "It's kind of a scary bush," said Georgie. "It's very dense. There's a hill in the middle of that bush with a very big tree on it. The top of that tree stands above everything else." Sylvia got excited, interrupted us, and said, "You know what? Maybe that big tree is a good thing to use in our assignment. I don't imagine anybody else will think of it. Maybe you two guys will get a bonus mark." "Great idea," I said. "Let's do it," said Jay, and we started making plans. Well, the plans will unfold, and I'm going to show you one of the things that Jay showed up with at, I'm saying but it's really Joel Franklin's house. and he showed up with that. And you're going, my goodness, what's that? I wasn't sure either when I first saw it. It's a J tractor. At least that's what Jay called it. He made it out of a couple of pieces of wood, and on top of the wood he also had a protractor. It was very crude, but it would do the job. Remember, we needed to measure some angles. So, recalling what Jay and Joel had told me 50 years ago, I made one of these this past Sunday and took it out in my yard. That's called whoops. Ah, there I am, standing in my yard. I don't know whether you can see it or not, but I've got a baseline established along there, and I'm measuring the angle to that big tree that sits in the middle of my yard. So angles like that will become important in our story. It's not a hugely mathematical story, so don't be worried about that. But a baseline and angles will allow you to measure the height of anything. It's even used in astronomy to measure solar distances. It does become important. Well, I've got some other things I want to mention. This assignment was due the next Friday, so of course they would have to go to the bush this weekend and do some work on it. I'm not going to read all of that chapter either. I'm just going to tell you that it wasn't an easy day because they needed an exceptionally long baseline, and they were going to use the county road. I've forgotten what the concession number was. I'll have to drive out that way again to look it up. But then they realized they couldn't see the tree from there. They had to go one concession further over. So this meant the baseline was going to be really big. So when they got together that Sunday afternoon to do their measurements, they had that sextant or J tractor or fancy protractor along with a wheel that contained 300 feet of rope that Jay had borrowed from his father's small construction company. So they could do all this measuring. And that's what they did. It wasn't a very pleasant chore, but it was kind of fun. And if you read the book, you'll see why. And what happened as a result of that? That keen interest in that huge tree that was sitting in the middle of the bush that could only be seen from about 2 side roads over. And it was sitting in this bush that Georgie and Sylvia maintained was very dense and very mysterious. That was enough to make the boys exceptionally interested in planning a trip to the bush. And the next time I talk to you, we'll talk about that trip into this bush. It's probably more dangerous and intriguing than what we talked about today. But this assignment is what caused them to have that interest. Now, I did want to mention a couple of other things. I've had some technical difficulties, so if you see me pausing here, it's because I'm trying to figure out what the heck to do next. I think I'm heading towards a good image. Let me see what it is. Oh, to contact me, if you want to contact me, if you'd like to send a note saying, you're terrible, stay off the air, I won't listen to you, but you can send it. Or if you're looking for a speaker, or if you want some help to get your own book started, then you can email me at ronsbooks@hotmail.com. Now, if I turn the camera, I don't need to turn the camera. You can see behind me on the wall bits and pieces of the first 33 books I've written. And think the last time I told you those ones along the top 7 with colored pictures are ones that are currently published. See what else I have. Books published to date. Hope you can see it. I'm having trouble seeing the small print. But this is a list of the books with a synopsis of a synopsis. And all that fancy words mean is it's a very short summary of a short summary of the book. And my short summary of the first book is Lightning at 200 Durham Street. There's a body and a ghost in the bush. I warned you about the bush. That's what's going to happen on that one. And you can see from these other books, short forms, what's in them as well. And if you want to purchase them, if you look at the bottom of the list, you can get them at amazon.ca. I know this is a lengthy commercial. Let's see what else I can find. That's the book we're talking about. Probably should have showed it earlier. I'll get better. By the time I've done 200 broadcasts, it'll be so smooth, you won't even need me for the next 200. Anyway, I hope you have a great day and a great week, and I'll see you next Monday.